Our next, speaker and panel and conversation, you heard John Podesta talk about threat multiplier, right? Climate crisis as threat multiplier. And we have Sherri Goodman, the Honorable Sherri Goodman, who literally has written the book on that. We said that last year because she joined us virtually, and this year she has the book, and it's out there, and if you haven't got it, you can get it, and afterwards she'll sign it for you if you want. And leading her in the conversation is Captain Andrea Cameron. She'll tell you a little more about herself, but you should know that she teaches us in a very serious fashion at the Naval War College, and is a Fulbright scholar. So some of you, ought to ask her about that if she doesn't talk about it and understand what it might take to be a Fulbright scholar, because it's pretty amazing achievement in its own right. And I should say the Honorable Sherri Goodman is Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and I bet she'll talk about this, but some of those things, the military 2014 and those kind of happenings, she was right there at the center of all that. But I'll step out of the way and let y'all take it from here.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. We've had a nice long day. That was an incredible scene setter for kind of big picture U.S. policy in the world. And now we're really going to dive deeper into the climate plus security discussion. As mentioned, my name is Captain Andrea Cameron. I'm a professor over at the Naval War College, and I teach in our National Security Affairs Department, and I also teach all of the climate change and national security electives over there. I was a Fulbright scholar last year, so I lived in Belgium for 6 months and worked with NATO doing climate security research with NATO, so I really enjoyed the NATO panel earlier. And since 2021, I've been serving in the Pentagon as well, their Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, that Arctic and Global Resilience Office, and that's where our climate change policy is coming from right now within the DoD. They're the ones working for Secretary Austin and putting information about climate out through the force. That's just a little bit about me, but today we're here to celebrate my role model, my mentor, Sherri Goodman. She has been a trendsetter all of her life, and that started. She worked in the Senate Armed Services Committee, working nuclear and security issues, and then through that got into be the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. So she kind of went from nuclear issues to environmental issues into climate change. And she had that role for almost 8 years, and now 30 plus years later, she has been a leader in kind of climate, environment, and the Arctic ever since. So welcome to our friend, Sherri Goodman. Yes, please, give her a round of applause, and then I'll tell you a little bit more. This is her book. It's out back. It's brand new, hot off the press, Threat Multiplier, Climate, Military Leadership, and the Fight for Global Security, the topic of today. This is what academics do. This is what students, right? This is what you do to a book, hopefully. You get into it, you digest it. This is my beautiful clean copy that Sherri can sign. But this has been a great release because it kind of documents 30 years of how this has evolved to where it is today. Before I have some questions for you, would you like to make any opening remarks, Sherri?
Well, first, thank you so much, Andrea. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. We did this just a few weeks ago in Newport, Rhode Island, at their Global Security Forum with John Kerry, former Secretary Kerry, Senators Reid and Whitehouse, and the Secretary of the Navy, and it's great to be here again. Thank you, Megan and Luke and Abby, all the organizers. You do a terrific job. And to Peter Kelly, the chair of the board. I've had the privilege of working with Peter since I joined the Center for Naval Analysis 2001, and he was on the board then. And just a bit of history, since we just heard from John Podesta, I'll tell you a funny story. So when I was at the Pentagon in the 90s as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, John Podesta was President Clinton's chief of staff. And at that time, we were closing a lot of military bases, and we had to clean them up. And my husband also worked in the Pentagon at that time, and I recall one Thanksgiving where John Podesta calls up my husband and me. So the joke was in the Pentagon, he closed the bases and I cleaned them up. And he called us up on Thanksgiving and he said, you guys got to get Miramar fixed, and now. So we were transferring, and we changed the mission up at Miramar at the time, and he wanted it moved more quickly. So I've been working with John for many years, and I do have to correct the record because it was 2007 I coined the phrase threat multiplier when I organized the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. And then it was adopted into the National Defense Authorization Act right that same year for the fiscal year 2008 National Defense Authorization Act. There's been a requirement to assess by the president in the national security strategy the security implications of climate change, and in the national defense strategy. That then the phrase threat multiplier, which we coined back in 2007 with the first CNA Military Advisory Board of many great generals and admirals, many really hailing also from this region. General Gordon Sullivan, who was the Army Chief of Staff, was our first chairman. We had Admiral Preer, who was former PACOM commander, General Zinni, former CENTCOM commander, Admiral Skip Bowman, who was head of the nuclear navy. But you all, the next generation of leaders I see here, you're going to be on the front lines of experiencing a changing climate, or climate as a threat multiplier. We already see, just think of what's happening in Europe now, from Portugal to Poland, from the wildfires to the floods, and in our own country, from the fires out west to the flooding and the hurricanes here. Our active duty and Guard and Reserve are ever more frequently called up to respond to climate-driven stress. And that's just in the developed countries. John, of course, Podesta also referred to the fact that we now have climate stress putting people on the move around the world, from drought-stricken parts of Africa to the opening sea lanes in the Arctic, to more terrifying typhoons in the Pacific, and changes in even Pacific Island nations, existentially threatening whole states and their sovereignty and their maritime territories.
Thank you for that scene setter. Now I'm going to ask you a very basic question, which is, how do you define climate security?
Okay.
You gave a bunch of examples.
I gave some examples, and I think when you asked me this question in Newport, I had a piece of paper in front of me with the actual definition from the Defense Authorization Act. Okay, I don't have that piece of paper today. But the good news is that it's actually defined in law. So for all of you folks, it's always good when you have a concept, if you get the legislators to actually put it in law, then it's authorized. You'll learn as you go through it. You want things authorized and appropriated. Okay, I learned that my first day as a Hill staffer. You got to put it in law, and then you got to get it funded. You need both. Okay, so the good news is there is a multi-pronged definition of climate security now in the Defense Authorization Bill, which essentially refers to it as the instability that occurs from the changes in our national systems threatening the fragility of states around the world, leading to more humanitarian crises and affecting our troops as they deploy.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask, because you've kind of alluded to it, we heard John Podesta say it, but the very famous term threat multiplier, how did this term, well, you kind of explained where it came from, but how does it still play relevance today?
Well, it's because all the things we've been talking about here at this conference, whether it's strategic competition with Russia and China, or in the Middle East, the AI, the new AI-driven threats we've seen, the cyber threats, all of that is made more complex and compounded by the changing climate. Because it's the instability in the natural systems that we face now, with hotter temperatures, retreating sea ice, rising sea levels, prolonged drought in many parts of the world. That's putting stress on food and water security, making people in already fragile regions with weak governance more vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. For example, climate serves as almost a petri dish for terrorism in many of the equatorial regions of Africa and Latin America, and then puts people on the move towards safer havens. In the Arctic, we see with retreating sea ice and warming temperatures, and it's about 4 degrees warmer in the Arctic than the global average now, that we could have ice-free Arctic summers as soon as a few decades from now, if not sooner. And Putin envisions the Northern Sea Route as a toll road for transportation from ports in China, in Asia, to ports in Europe. And China eyes the Arctic as a near-Arctic stakeholder seeking to extract energy, minerals, and in the future, fish from that region, as well as taking advantage of the shorter shipping routes. And we've also seen this summer for the first time a non-ice-clad vessel transit the Arctic. Now, there wasn't an incident, but to me, it's just an oil spill waiting to happen in the Arctic. And if you think that the Exxon Valdez, for those of you who remember, or the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf were tough to clean up, an Arctic oil spill in international waters is going to be very, very complex.
Mm-hmm. So for over 30 years, you've been going around the world talking about climate and environmental issues. And one of your current roles, you're the Secretary General of the International Military Council on Climate and Security. But based on all of this international engagement, maybe I should have asked the NATO people earlier, but I'd just like to hear your perspective on what you're hearing. What is the appetite abroad to engage with the United States on climate security?
Well, in NATO, it is, first of all, it's very high in general. In NATO, it's, General Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary General, has made this a high priority. Canada raised its hand to be the NATO nation, and thank you to our Canadian friend here. And we just launched, together with Prime Minister Trudeau, this summer at the NATO summit in Washington. Canada is hosting the first NATO Center of Excellence on Climate and Security. That's very important because NATO has many centers of excellence. When something reaches sort of a critical mass of importance for NATO, it's going to be, it gets a center of excellence. That means it provides training and education as well as policy and analysis. And what's going to be increasingly important, and where NATO plays a vital role in being the strongest military alliance in the world now with 30 members, is in its standardization and interoperability of its forces. So you all, when you're actually, in deployments, if you do a NATO deployment, you're going to want to be able to have common communications and common systems with our NATO allies and friends. And as we have to adapt and make resilient our forces in the climate era, we've got to do this together. And that's partly where NATO is headed now, understanding climate risk to NATO forces as they operate from the Arctic to the Mediterranean into the Atlantic, and then also understanding how, as we transform our energy systems, we do that in a way that enables future interoperability as we move to new fuels, better batteries, all of the technology that's going to be changing in coming years.
We'll come to the fuels question in just a minute, but I want to bring it, we kind of asked internationally. I want to bring it home because we talk about our home bases. And in the book you say climate readiness is mission readiness. What do you mean by that?
Well, and also the Navy has been a big champion of this, but not only the Navy. Thank you, Andrea. I know you're whispering in some ears back there in the Pentagon and OPNAV. We can't be ready for today's and tomorrow's conflicts unless we're ready to operate in a changing climate. So we have to prepare our soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines to operate in hotter temperatures. Today we have more Black Flag days than ever before, where the wet bulb temperature is above 95 degrees, and we've had to, in some cases, stop training or adjust training. And there's only going to be more of those in the future. So we have to be ready to operate in hotter and colder temperatures in the Arctic as we see a more ice-free Arctic. We also, you all have to be protected from increasing infectious disease and disease vectors. Climate and health is a growing focus. Last week I was at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where the school is one of the best public health schools in the country, is really focused on how do we better understand those dimensions of climate and health. And we have to ensure at home that our bases are resilient. Norfolk Navy base, got a NATO headquarters down there in Norfolk. It already experiences sunny day flooding from sea levels that have already risen, and piers are being adjusted to accommodate rising seas and stronger storms and coastal erosion. So the military is really on the front lines today of ensuring that we can perform 24/7 in a changing climate, whether it's stronger storms or a power outage. And, for example, at the Naval Academy, some of you who's at the Naval Academy? Oh, you guys already left. I'm sorry. Okay. But, there's already a major investment at the Naval Academy to protect it from increasing sea level rise in Annapolis.
I want to switch back to the fuel question now. I'm going to ask the question, give a little context, and ask it again. You pose a question in the book: how can the military reduce emissions without sacrificing security? And you ask it then in the context of the 1990s. You were the DoD, part of the Clinton administration, who was negotiating the Kyoto protocols. But why am I bringing it back? Because that's the exact same question we ask ourselves today. How can the military reduce emissions without sacrificing security?
Right. Well, we've learned today that actually as we advance our energy systems and adopt new energy technology, we're actually improving our military performance in many dimensions. So this is it's a multi-pronged transition in our energy systems. We used to think that for more military effectiveness, we needed more fossil fuels. Now we've learned that in certain systems, for example, think the move now towards hybrid ground vehicles. Our Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, talks about how hybrid ground vehicles have better torque and are quieter. So they provide advantage. Not only do they use less fuel, but use less fossil fuel, but they're actually have military benefits in effectiveness. So this is going to be the future. And oh, by the way, we have to win. John Podesta talked about, the negotiations with China, and, we're trying to compete with China, which is setting, the pacing threat for our forces today. But it's not only, the military competition is important, but the race to the top on advanced energy is really important for us too. We cannot afford to lose the advanced energy transition. Look, we were the leaders in building nuclear power. Look, this is a nuclear state, right? I mean, look at what we've got here in this state and the safest nuclear power. But we have lost American leadership in deploying civilian nuclear power in this country. And now China's a major exporter, as is Russia. We have to regain leadership in nuclear energy. We've got to do that in solar, renewables, batteries, critical minerals, every dimension of the decarbonized energy economy. The U.S. has got to be leading it. The investments that we've made so far through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act are good, but they have to continue. And we need all the energy sources we need, and we need to deploy them in a way that keeps us at the forefront of both innovation and deployment for our military and our civilian economy.
So now John Podesta and you have talked a lot about decarbonizing, and that's a key component of any climate action. And this has been a debate for years, so I want to kind of bring the debate to the forefront. How does decarbonizing affect military readiness? And you have talked about this a long time. Can you explain why this part of climate policy is so important to a security audience?
Right. Well, you have to be able to operate 24/7. So, for example, if the grid goes down at your military base, you've got to, that mission-critical infrastructure still has to operate. That's why in the net zero goals the department has today, they're one of the most important tools to achieving that net zero goal and ensuring energy security at the same time is to have a microgrid at most military bases. Now, yes, of course, you can run you can put your diesel generator on that microgrid, but you can also put renewables and long-duration storage. And you can, in some places, the first net zero military base in the US, which is Marine Corps Base Albany in Georgia. Kudos to them. And there will be more. I think the second one just went operational at Fort Hunter Liggett in California. They've got like waste to energy plants where they're extracting methane from the landfill. So, it's going to be, there's no silver bullet, as we say, but there's a lot of silver buckshot in the way we think about transforming our energy systems.
Excellent. Energy diversification is really, really important. A lot of conversations I have is with that. Now I want to switch again kind of back to this global theme of our event, because we've talked a lot about building partner capacity and security cooperation programs, many of which you've been involved in over the years, as well as, I'll throw in a new term for most people here, environmental peace building. But one of the concepts I liked in the book was from a mutual colleague of ours, Swati Veeravalli. She was at AFRICOM, and now she's at the National Security Council, working with John Podesta. But the concept was mutually assured resilience. You might remember mutually assured destruction as the mantra of the Cold War. So this idea of mutually assured resilience, I found it fascinating. Can you explain what jumps out to you? What does that mean, and why is it important?
Thanks, Andrea. And John Podesta, in his remarks, when he referred to the new policy being released today, White House policy on climate resilience and security, that is Swati Veeravalli's
Yes, it is.
Policy that she's been working on. We both know her well and working very hard. And she's an Army Corps of Engineers environmental scientist who has been working since really the start of her career, first at ERDIC and then at UCOM, at Stuttgart, and now she's finishing up a tour at the National Security Council, where she has coined this phrase, which I quote in the book, on mutually assured resilience. So what does that mean? I mean, in this era of global interdependence and climate as a threat multiplier, we can't think that just ensuring resilience for ourselves here at home is enough. Our allies and partners are our strength and our core to our security. And having resilience in communities around the world is going to also enable American national security. So it's important as we're developing our foreign policy and international security relationships and cooperation to build understanding of climate resilience into those relationships. For example, we now think much more, we now think of the small Pacific Island nations between Hawaii and China, the ones that were so critical in World War II to our being able to defeat Japan. In the Cold War, maybe less important strategically, but now in this era of strategic competition with China and the climate era, many of the small Pacific Island nations, from Melanesia to Micronesia, from Tuvalu to Kiribati, into the Solomon Islands, and certainly the Philippines, Vietnam, and all those other countries that are even closer to China, but they are strategically important, Papua New Guinea among them, to our ability to project power in the region. But many of them are highly vulnerable to climate risks. Some of the small island nations will lose part of their atolls to sea level rise and loss of fresh water, even in the coming decades, to the point that the president of Kiribati former president of Kiribati already secured land in Fiji to move some of his population, and Tuvalu is looking at having to move some of its population to Australia or New Zealand. So when we want to work with them to have them be part of the American partnership rather than under China's influence, we also have to understand what it takes for them to be resilient to the threats that they face. And some of that is having climate resilient infrastructure, changing energy systems, and also protecting their EEZs and also their territorial waters from the increasing illegal, unregulated, and ungoverned fishing they face, which is very much a part of the economies of these regions.
Thank you, Sherri. I'm going to ask 2 quick questions, and then I'll open up the floor. Hold on. We got some ambitious questions. That's great. But first for the whole audience. First for the older people in the audience, maybe faculty or other community members. If you had one message for them, what would it be?
Well, the message is this is a core part of your a core part of how we think about security today. And the good news is it's become much more mainstreamed. The bad news is the pace of climate change is really accelerating faster than our ability to adapt to it today.
All right, for the young people in the audience today, if you had one message for them, what would it be?
Well, make this a core part of your mission, and also don't be afraid to speak up and be a change agent. I'd say, I've spent most of my life in and out of government, in or right next to government in various roles and positions, and I've tried to be a change agent from within. And I think that you will see a lot of change in your time. I started out in nuclear weapons in the Cold War, really before the environmental era. And as I say, my career went from weapons to waste and then into climate. You don't know what's going to be on the front lines for you 10 years from now. But you're getting the skills today in your training, in your leadership to be able to carry that forward into the future.
Thank you, Sherri. I deal with this a lot, and I haven't found a single military career field yet that is not already being affected by climate change, and you are better warfighters by actually thinking through how that will affect your careers in the future. Now, I'd like to go up front for my gentleman who really wants to ask the question. So you'll get first, and you can go second if you'd like. So go ahead.
Ma'am, first and foremost, thank you for your work regarding climate security. My name is Cadet Almodovar from West Point. So my question is, with the rising ambiguity in the international security norm, with China being an adversary, how do you convince the big players to be on board, especially when the U.S. historically is the biggest contributor to climate decline or change?
Thank you.
It's a great question. So, today China is the world's largest emitter, but the U.S. has been. So China and the U.S. both have to reduce their emissions. I think we have to be, in international diplomacy and international affairs, we have to be humble about, and about our own circumstances, that we have, we've been a polluter in the past, whether it's contaminated bases or carbon pollution. And so we need to, we need not to be defensive about that, but we also need to work with nations that are deeply affected, as well as our own, to help build resilience, share technology, share innovation, share some of the tools, and learn from them. The learning goes both ways.
Excellent. Sure, go ahead. I'm open to questions from the back, too, if anyone wants to chime in from back there. Go ahead.
Thank you, ladies. I'm Major Radek. I'm an international relations instructor from West Point, and mine kind of is on a similar topic to that. So how can the United States build trust as a strong leader and a reliable partner when we're looking at this goal of mutually assured resilience, when our rhetoric is turning us more and more into an adversary with the country that we need to work with most, and when climate change is a long-term problem that cannot flip-flop every 4 years?
Sherri, I look forward to your answer.
Yeah.
Nice softball for you.
Right. Well, you can't search trust. So that's, we have to be there in an enduring way. And it is a problem for the United States now, internationally, if we are seen as an unreliable partner. So when we pull out of Paris, when we don't deliver on our commitments, that undermines our ability to be a trusted ally and partner. I agree with that. I will say that sometimes the rhetoric exceeds the reality, and that there are ways to maintain relationships. And I've worked hard to do that with allies and partners and within the US government, even during the years when climate was not high on the White House agenda. And did that solve all the problems? No, but I ran a series of projects. One of my think tank hats is at the Wilson Center, and I ran a series of projects with the Department of Defense and NOAA on improving predictive capability for disruptive water and security events, and we did regional case studies engaging people around the world, and we served sort of as a surrogate interagency and surrogate convening for people on climate security without even calling it climate security. I will say that, the Department of Defense developed the Defense Climate Assessment Tool, which is an infrastructure assessment tool for climate risk that started in the Corps, Army Corps, and then was adopted DoD-wide. And it did that from the years starting before the Trump administration, continuing throughout it, and then has fielded it now, sharing with allies and partners. So some of that work continued, even below the level of the polarized rhetoric. But I will say it's not helpful.
Excellent. Another question? Go ahead.
So I was just interested in hearing more about your background when you mentioned nuclear energy. I'm just interested in hearing a little bit more about that and what brought you from that to what you were doing now.
Okay, well, so when I was in college, first I remember going to I went to Amherst College. I was in the second class of women. I did a course there's something called SCUSA at West Point. Okay, you guys know that? Okay, I went to SCUSA and I was like, oh, this stuff is really great. I like to do that. I loved international security. I spent a year at the London School of Economics. I studied international relations there. And when I went to write my senior thesis, I met at a conference while I was there some senior officials in the Defense Department at the time who were there for a conference, and I said, okay, I need a topic to write maybe some of you are thinking about, what am I gonna write if you have to write a senior thesis? What should I write it on? And someone suggested I examine the neutron bomb controversy, which was in the 1970s, in the Carter administration, we suggested deploying a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon to Europe. And our NATO allies, particularly Germany and the UK at the time, said, no, thank you, we don't want a low-yield, a nuclear weapon that kills people and leaves buildings standing. We want you to hold Moscow and Washington at risk and not Bonn then and London. So I examined, through the lens of bureaucratic politics and the essence of decision, that decision. And then I decided, and I interviewed many people who were working in government on that, and then it was published as a small book. And then I decided I wanted to stay in that field of nuclear weapons and arms control. In the Cold War, that seemed like the most important decision, the most important area of strategy and policy. And so I went to Washington. I worked at a company called SAIC for a few years after college. And then I say sometimes, well, if I could have been very smart and stayed, it was an employee-owned company at the time. and I would have been very wealthy and retired. But I decided to go to graduate school. Many of you will go to graduate school. I went to Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and I met some of the faculty I worked with there, then introduced me. The one Bob Murray, who had been an Undersecretary of the Navy, introduced me to Senator Nunn, and that's how I got to the Armed Services Committee. He had just become chairman of the committee, and I had oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex. And so at first, when I started, I was overseeing nuclear weapons research, development, and production, and all those facilities failed in the late 1980s for environment, safety, and health lapses. And then my career kind of transitioned to environmental oversight and management of them. Then I practiced environmental law for a few years, and then I came back as the Pentagon's first chief environmental officer. So that was how I made the transition. And, I think you'll all see something will change, during the course of your careers. It won't be whatever is the topics of this Global Security Forum will not be the topic when you come back 20 years from now. Mm-hmm. There'll be other focus areas. And so, you want to be able to adapt your skills and your interests so that you can, have impact throughout.
Absolutely. And one thing I always tell any young person is if you have any sense of where your career is, probably every flag officer would agree with me, think it's gonna go off on a trajectory that you never imagined, and expect that and enjoy the ride and take every single opportunity that the military offers you along the way. There are literally thousands of them, and it's just a really fun ride. I want to thank Sherri Goodman. She has the book available. She'll be doing book signings after this talk.
Now, I have to say, I saw my friend David Sanger at the airport as I came in, and he said, okay, I saw your book out there, and he said, my book's sold out. I said, okay, all right, you guys have to make sure my book sells out now, too. So I'm going to be out there. I'm happy to sign your book.
Thank you. Turn it back over.